Kia ora everyone, and thank you for joining us this lunchtime to hear about our advice on the NDC. Ko Charlie Keeling aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communication engagement team at the Commission, and I'll shortly give a brief overview of how the session will run today. But before I do that, I'm going to ask Matt to lead us into the session with a karakia.
Thanks, Charlie. Koe poia te Māori, koe poia te Wairua, koe poia te Tapu, koe poia te whenua o Papatūānuku.
Kia ora, Matt, thank you. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions throughout this session. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions. We might not get a chance to cover all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can. And feel free to use the chat if you have any thoughts or comments you'd like to share. It's always good to see your conversations. And I just want to let you know that we are recording this session, so if anyone was unable to make it, can watch it on our website afterwards. And now I'm going to hand over to Matt.
Thanks, Charlie. Kia ora koutou katoa. Ko Matt Smith aho. I'm a principal analyst here at the Climate Change Commission. I'm going to talk briefly about the NDC advice we provided to government, discuss a few of the key changes we made since draft advice, and then throw it open for your questions about that advice. Just to recap quickly what our final recommendations were, the government asked us to advise them on the compatibility of the current NDC with contributing to global efforts under the Paris Agreement to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We advised that the current NDC is not compatible with contributing to that effort, and that to make it more compatible, it would need to represent reductions of much more than 36% below 2005 levels. How much further, we said, was a question for government that would reflect the government's tolerance for climate risks, economic impacts, and reputation, international reputation. Next slide. Some of the key bits of feedback we got on the draft NDC advice, there are a few key points. First of all, submitters generally didn't see why the emission budgets allowed more emissions than the NDC, which went hand in hand with opposition to the use of offshore mitigation in the NDC. There was somewhat mixed views about the level of ambition in our NDC recommendations, about a third wanting stronger action, a sixth agreeing with our recommendations, and about half wanting less action. In terms of how we addressed that feedback on the issue of ambition, it didn't change our view that the contribution Aotearoa makes to the global effort is not a technical or scientific question. And so we had split the question into what is needed to limit warming at a global level to 1.5 degrees, and presented one way of downscaling that to Aotearoa's level. Given that our current NDC is at the lower end of that range, and it's not compatible with contributing to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, but that there is no one correct way of saying what our contribution should be. That is an ethical and political question that should be made by elected leaders. On the question of emission budgets in the NDC, we added further discussion around why the two are different and a bit more context that I'm going to cover off now before moving into your questions. So just briefly, next slide, Charlie. When you look at the country's successive emission targets, this graph shows the allowed emissions under our first target under the Kyoto Protocol from 2008 to 2012. Those under our second target, 2020 target that was taken outside the Kyoto Protocol, and under the current NDC. Now, these figures have been recalculated to match the current inventory, but they show how our targets have been increasing in ambition, allowing less emissions each time. And if we were starting at the level of the 2020 target, meeting our current NDC would be quite doable. But we're not starting there. Charlie? The blue line represents our net emissions. And as you can see, our net emissions are going up at the same time as our targets are getting more stringent. This is because the contribution that forestry makes to offset our emissions is dropping away. We've relied on a large area of forests planted in the 1990s to offset emissions to meet past targets rather than reducing emissions domestically. As that offset drops away, our net emissions rise, and we are starting from a level much higher than our current NDC. This makes it very difficult to meet the current NDC domestically, which is why offshore mitigation continues to play a part in meeting the first NDC. And with that, I think I will throw it open for questions.
Thanks, Matt. The first question we've got here is, what evidence did the Commission use to reach its judgment about international expectations?
So we consulted experts at the Ministry for the Environment and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who are involved in the negotiations on the Paris Rulebook, to say that we don't think a split gas NDC would meet current expectations. If the government takes a different view, it is open to change.
Thanks, Matt. Is the NDC to be unconditional, with targets taking no account of what the rest of the world is doing in practice?
Our current NDC at the present, I believe, is conditional on access to international markets. Our advice was, or the question we were asked was not what NDC should New Zealand have. We were asked to assess compatibility with contributing to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Taking account of what the rest of the world is doing in practice is part of the reason we left the recommendation on what it should be for government, who can take account of a wider set of factors.
Thanks, Matt. Why is the split target not considered economy-wide an absolute?
Because it applies a lesser target to part of the economy. It could be considered economy-wide and absolute on one interpretation, whether our international partners would also consider it economy-wide and absolute is up for debate. As the expectation is that once you have included an aspect in your international target, that it will continue to be included in your target. And so a split gas NDC could be seen to be moving away from what we've done in the past.
Thanks, Matt. Why is New Zealand the only country with an NDC target that goes beyond what it is doing domestically? And why did you not see fit to point out that we are an outlier here?
So I don't believe that we are the only country that is using that I understand that Switzerland is also using offshore mitigation to meet part of its NDC and has already taken steps to establish the relationships to generate that. While we may be an outlier in that respect now, it would certainly not be any different from our previous targets, which have used offshore mitigation as a key component. And indeed, our previous targets have been conditional on access to offshore mitigation.
Thank you, Matt. Why did the Commission use 2010 gross emissions to identify consistency of 2030 reductions with 1.5 degrees, rather than 2010 net levels as used in the IPCC 1.5 report scenarios?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Which question is that, Charlie? 2010 gross emissions rather than 2010 net levels. So that gets into the distinction between how targets are set, this gross net accounting issue, and in part it was to do with a consistency with target accounting, and in part it was a first principles reasoning of the gross net distinction itself. So when you look at the Kyoto Protocol rules, they established that targets were to be set on gross emissions unless your land sector was a source in the base year. The reasoning behind that rule is that if your land sector is a source, it needs to be reduced just like any other source. If your land sector is a sink, it essentially is a mitigation option that can be continued or can be substituted for gross reductions. It wasn't saying that planting needs to continue, which wouldn't be sustainable. It was saying that you can use net emissions as a mitigation to offset gross emissions if you would like. The IPCC applied their reduction to net emissions because at a global level, the land sector is a source of emissions. Applying those rules consistently to New Zealand, where the land sector has been a sink, we don't need to plant indefinitely to maintain that sink, that IPCC said. So it was a consistent application of the rules, given the reasoning for those rules.
Thanks, Matt. This uses a multiplier of 1.8 in its example table 22.1. Does the Commission now consider this to be an appropriate multiplier, the draft having left that question uncertain? And if not, what range does it consider it appropriate?
We used the multiplier of 1.8 taken from the 2015 Infometrics work as the best available information. Our modelling was set up to address the question of our domestic pathway, and so did not pull out a separate multiplier for terms of trade effects from offshore purchasing. It's kind of a second order question. It's the cost of offshore mitigation is it's highly uncertain, and the multiplier to be used is only one part of that uncertainty. It's probably dwarfed by the price. So we essentially said that that's a second order question to the uncertainty around how much that mitigation is going to cost. That really depends on which countries the government partners with and what kind of opportunities are available there. So the multiplier effect, we're open to other multipliers that could be used, but that's kind of a question for government rather than for us.
Thanks, Matt. Could you please speak to why the Commission chose much more than 36% rather than just more than 36%? What does the Commission define as the difference between more and much more?
So this gets at our approach to the overall question. So we'd said that the IPCC pathways tell us what reductions are needed at a global level. We downscaled those pathways to New Zealand, and then the 36% is the middle of that range. Now, what that doesn't take account of any question of our fair share or what a fair contribution would be from Aotearoa. And so the much more is getting at the fact that for us to contribute as a developed nation to a global effort, we should be aiming for reductions of much more than that midpoint. But how much more is not a technical question, it's not a scientific question, it's an ethical and political question. And so that is where we for the government to decide.
Thanks, Matt. We just had a couple of quite detailed ones, so we're just going to have a little look at those. We have had one in the meantime, though. Where did the discussion of metrics go? It was in the draft report, but not in the final advice.
Some of that has been pulled into the evidence report. So in the science of climate change has some discussion of metrics. We did change some of that section in response to feedback.
I have had a couple of questions on target accounting. I don't know if you would be able to talk a little bit more in response to those, just a bit more generally, or?
Sure. One of the questions we got through consultation was around the justification for using a different set of forestry accounting to what the inventory uses in their reporting. This is not new. New Zealand has accounted for forestry using a separate set of subset of forestry since our first target in 2008, and this has been included in the greenhouse gas inventory every year since then. The reporting and accounting are fundamentally different purposes. So reporting is around what the atmosphere sees this year in terms of the change in emissions. Accounting is looking at what change is additional and enduring in order to incentivize action. And so when you look at forestry, particularly plantation forestry, it operates in a cyclical fashion over much longer timescales, several decades. If we were to, for the same set of figures that we report on annually, then that would be to introduce a lot of variability into our accounting without representing any particularly enduring change. You know, we know for a given area of forest that after a certain point, the emissions sequestered will be balanced by an equal amount of carbon emitted when that forest is harvested. And these repeated cycles of harvesting and sequestration balance out over the long term. Rather than have a hugely variable set of accounts, what we do is we say how much of that sequestration is additional, and we get credit for that, but no more. Only credit for the additional forests, and that operates in two ways. The international community agreed on a 1990 baseline, and so any forests that were planted before 1990 just have to remain in forest, and we don't get credit for that. There's, in addition, the averaging rule means you get credit for a forest up to its average carbon stock, and after that, we don't get any further credit than that. So it is in order to ensure that we are only taking credit for additional action that is going to actually contribute to climate change in one direction or the other.
Thank you, Matt. Why did you use averaging in the emissions budgeting in reference? Who else does this, and why is New Zealand using different accounting methods than any other country? But we can reference that more to the NDC.
I don't know that one off the top of my head, but I might throw that one to Eva Murray, who's also here.
Hi. So I'll just answer this question, given that we're focused today on the nationally determined contribution. I'll answer it with reference to the nationally determined contribution, the NDC. Basically, under the Paris Agreement, there's more freedom for countries and parties to the Paris Agreement to determine accounting methods that are, while they have to meet certain standards of consistency and so forth, they are able to define elements of the accounting so that they have an appropriate accounting method for their national circumstances. And in New Zealand's case, the government, when it set the NDC back in 2015, notified the international community and the UNFCCC that it would use averaging for forests. So this is what we have used in our analysis for the nationally determined contribution, because this is what New Zealand has, how New Zealand has defined its nationally determined contribution. And actually, while there are some features of how we'll be applying averaging in New Zealand that are specific to New Zealand because it relates to the nature of our forest estate and so forth, it is not actually completely unlike what is used in other countries. In fact, I understand that the European Union uses a method that is somewhat similar to averaging for their forestry accounting.
Okay, thanks Eva. We've got the next one now. Does the Commission envisage that in the event of offshore mitigation not transpiring to the scale needed by 2030, or that costs escalate further, that domestic emissions budgets would need to be strengthened to meet the NDC?
I think to a certain extent I would reject the premise of the question. We would see that it is within the power of the government to ensure that offshore mitigation is available to the scale needed by 2030, and that it is up to the government to go and establish the linkages that would make that happen. We do not need to rely on an international mechanism that is yet to be set up. We can go and make those linkages happen now, and some work has already gone into establishing those. So our budgets are set at a level that we believe is both ambitious and achievable. And it would take considerable new evidence for us to adjust those.
Thanks, Matt. We've probably got time just for a couple more now, and then we'll have to close. So the IPCC SR 15 Chapter 2 lead author expressly warned against reinterpreting the scenarios considered by the IPCC. How do you justify misusing the chapter he wrote in a way he specifically said we should not?
Yep, so we are aware of what Uri Rogel wrote about those scenarios, and we looked across the whole set of scenarios with no or limited overshoot. In particular, we looked at whether the reductions in those scenarios were correlated, i.e. whether if you've got scenarios with higher reductions in biogenic methane, can they be traded off against CO2? And the relationship wasn't really there. We used those scenarios as a basis for saying what is needed for 1.5 degrees, because that is the question we got asked. And for all that, there was a caveat on those scenarios. They are the best evidence available. So we've used them as a starting point for assessing the NDC. We have not used them as kind of the whole exercise. Within that, we then considered New Zealand circumstances and what our contribution should be and where in that range we might fall. So it's in part a limitation of the time and resources we had available to look at what a contribution to 1.5 degrees would be.
Thanks, Matt. Just one more question. We've asked a question about a 1.5 degrees NDC. 1.5 degrees NDC, a consistent NDC for New Zealand would account for the cumulative emissions since 2010 and how much they exceed the SR15 pathway? Why has the Commission not considered these cumulative emissions?
So to a certain extent we did. So the way we developed the kind of comparator NDC budgets that we used was based on 2010 emissions and the 2010 modelled reductions by gas in the IPCC pathways. The fact that our emissions have gone up since 2010 is one of the reasons that, you know, we are not compatible with that pathway, and one of the reasons why it is very difficult for us to now turn that around. For us to meet that domestically and turn that around would require very steep reductions because we're starting so much higher. So they were considered and they were accounted for, particularly in the assessment that we're not compatible with that contribution.
Thanks, Matt. I'll just quickly squeeze the last one in and then hand over to you for closing karakia. Given the UNEP now says we must cut human-induced methane by 45% by 2030, what contribution should New Zealand make?
So we looked at the UNEP Global Methane Assessment Report. Many of those reductions came from sectors that were less applicable to New Zealand. And so some of the emissions, methane emissions from agriculture in that assessment, for example, were from rice cultivation. And a lot of the reductions came from the fossil fuel sector. So our target is for biogenic methane, which is methane from agriculture and waste. And we considered that our evidence base on the reduction opportunities that is specific to New Zealand was a better, more specific set of information to base our emission budgets on.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'll just hand over to Matt to see us out with the karakia.
Haere I roto I te maramatanga, haere I roto I te rangimarie, tukoa tō wairoa, kia tō te rangimarie, kia tātou katoa, hou pai marire.